A boy brings home his best friend expecting a normal day, until his mother freezes. Her hands shake, her vision blurs, and tears start falling, because this boy looks exactly like the son she lost 10 years ago. Same eyes, same smile, same birthmark. Could it really be him? If this is her son, where has he been all these years? And what will happen when the truth finally comes out? Stay tuned. You won't believe what happens next. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Caroline's wooden spoon moved methodically through the pot of simmering pasta sauce, the rich aroma of garlic and herbs filling the kitchen. Soft jazz played from her small blue speaker on the windowsill, and the late afternoon sun cast warm shadows across the granite countertop. It was just another Wednesday, peaceful and ordinary, until it wasn't. The front door burst open with a bang that made Caroline jump. Tommy's familiar laugh echoed through the house, followed by the thump of his backpack hitting the floor near the couch. "Mom, I'm home," Tommy called out, "and I brought my friend." Caroline smiled, stirring the sauce one last time. "In the kitchen, honey." She lowered the heat under the pot and wiped her hands on her apron, turning to greet her son and his visitor. The moment she saw the boy standing behind Tommy, the wooden spoon clattered to the floor. Her hands flew to her mouth, and her knees went weak. The boy, Tommy had mentioned his name was Malik, stood uncertainly in worn sneakers that had seen better days. His faded blue hoodie was a size too big, and his hands were stuffed deep in the pockets. But it wasn't his clothes that made Caroline's world tilt on its axis. It was his face, those eyes. That particular way his eyebrows drew together when he was uncertain, exactly like Isaiah's used to. The same warm brown skin tone, the same curve of his cheek, even the same tiny scar above his right eyebrow. "Mom?" Tommy's voice seemed to come from far away. "Are you okay?" Caroline gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. The room spun slightly, and she felt tears welling up in her eyes. She tried to blink them away, but they escaped anyway, rolling down her cheeks. "Hi, Mrs. Lawson," Malik said softly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His voice was quiet, cautious, so different from Tommy's usual boisterous tone. "Thank you for having me over." Caroline couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up entirely. She managed a weak nod, trying desperately to pull herself together. "This is Malik," Tommy announced, seemingly oblivious to his mother's distress. "He just started at our school last week, and he's amazing at Minecraft. We're going to build this awesome fortress together." He grabbed a package of cookies from the counter. "Can we have these? We'll be in my room." Before Caroline could respond, Tommy had already grabbed Malik's arm and was pulling him toward the hallway. Malik glanced back at her once, his dark eyes full of confusion and something else. Worry, maybe, or recognition. Then they disappeared down the hall, their footsteps fading away. Caroline's legs finally gave out and she sank to the floor, her back against the kitchen cabinets. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together in her lap. The sauce continued to simmer on the stove, forgotten. "This isn't possible," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to clear her vision, trying to think straight. But all she could see was Isaiah's face, the same face she'd just seen on Tommy's new friend. From down the hall came the sound of laughter, Tommy's loud and clear, and Malik's softer, but just as genuine. The sound of it sent shivers down Caroline's spine. She knew that laugh. She'd heard it in her dreams for 10 years, had remembered it from when Isaiah was just a toddler. She forced herself to take deep breaths, counting them like she taught her kindergarten students to do when they felt overwhelmed. 1, 2, 3. Her hands still shook as she wiped away her tears. Caroline's hands trembled as she locked the bathroom door behind her. The click of the lock echoed in the small space, matching the thundering of her heart. She gripped the cool edge of the porcelain sink, her knuckles white with tension as she stared at her reflection in the mirror. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually neat brown hair hung limp around her face. "This can't be real," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the bathroom fan. "But what if—" She couldn't finish the thought. The memory hit her like a physical blow, making her knees weak. Suddenly, she wasn't in her bathroom anymore. She was standing on her front porch 10 years ago, the spring sun warm on her skin. Isaiah, her beautiful 3-year-old boy, was playing with his toy trucks in the yard. His curly hair caught the sunlight, turning almost golden. "Mama, look!" he had called out, showing her how he'd lined up his trucks in perfect rows. "Just a minute, sweetheart," she'd answered, turning to grab his sippy cup from the porch table. It couldn't have been more than 30 seconds. But when she turned back, the trucks sat abandoned in the grass. The yard was empty. Caroline remembered how her heart had stopped, how her voice had grown hoarse from screaming his name. The neighbors had come running. The police arrived within minutes. For weeks they searched. Missing posters with Isaiah's dimpled smile covered every telephone pole and store window in town. But eventually, the case went cold. No leads, no answers. Just silence and an empty bedroom she couldn't bear to change. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Caroline splashed cold water on her face. She had to pull herself together. She couldn't fall apart, not now, not with Tommy and Malik still in the house. Back in the kitchen, she methodically cleared the dinner dishes, trying to keep her hands steady. But her eyes kept drifting to Malik, who sat at the table finishing his milk. Every movement, every gesture seemed hauntingly familiar. There was the way he smiled, that same dimple appearing in his left cheek. The slight tilt of his head when Tommy told him about their upcoming science project, exactly like Isaiah used to do when listening to bedtime stories. But it was when Malik reached up to scratch behind his ear that Caroline's world tilted on its axis. The glass in her hand nearly slipped through her trembling fingers. There, partially hidden by his dark curls, was a small, crescent-shaped birthmark, identical to the one Isaiah had been born with. Caroline's breath caught in her throat as she steadied the glass, her mind spinning. "Thanks for dinner, Mrs. Lawson," Malik said softly, standing up from the table. His voice snapped her back to the present. It was really good. "You're welcome, sweetheart," she managed to reply, the endearment slipping out before she could stop it. She watched as he followed Tommy down the hallway to his room, their footsteps fading away. The moment they were gone, Caroline gripped the kitchen counter, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. The resemblance was too strong to be coincidence, the birthmark, the dimple, even the way he moved. Her hands pressed against the cool granite as the question she'd been trying to avoid crashed through her defenses. Could this boy really be my son? The morning sun streamed through the car windows as Caroline navigated the familiar route to school. Her eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, studying Malik's face as he sat in the back seat with Tommy. The boys were absorbed in their conversation about a new video game, their animated voices filling the car, but Caroline barely heard their words over the pounding of her own heart. Every gesture, every expression Malik made sent a jolt through her heart. The way his nose crinkled when he laughed, just like it had in all those precious baby photos she still kept. How he absently tugged at his ear when thinking, a habit so achingly familiar it made her chest tight. These weren't just similarities. They were exact matches to her memories of Isaiah, like watching a recording from the past play out in front of her eyes. That afternoon, Caroline set out cookies and milk on the kitchen counter, arranging everything with nervous precision. Her hands shook slightly as she positioned them on her favorite blue ceramic plate, practicing the casual questions she'd rehearsed all day in her head until they felt natural enough not to raise suspicion. "These cookies are awesome, Mrs. Lawson," Malik said, reaching for another one, chocolate crumbs dotting his chin. "Thank you, sweetie." Caroline's voice was gentle as she leaned against the counter, trying to appear relaxed despite her racing heart. "Where are you from originally, Malik?" Malik's shoulders lifted in a small shrug, his fingers fidgeting with the cookie. "I don't really know." He dunked his cookie in the milk, his eyes downcast, focused on the swirling white liquid. "The social workers found me in some park when I was 3. Nobody knew who I was or where I came from." The glass of milk in Caroline's hand nearly slipped, the liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. 3 years old, just like Isaiah. Her stomach clenched so tight she could barely breathe, and the kitchen seemed to spin around her. "That must have been hard," she managed to say, gripping the counter behind her for support. her knuckles turning white with the effort. "I guess." Malik's voice was quiet, almost lost in the afternoon stillness. "I've been in different foster homes since then. Never stayed anywhere too long." He glanced up at her with those familiar brown eyes that seemed to hold a universe of unspoken hurt. "But Angela, that's my foster mom now. She's really nice. Been with her almost a year." Caroline nodded, fighting to keep her expression neutral, though her heart was screaming. "And your birth parents? Did they ever?" "Nope." Malik popped the P sound, trying to sound casual, but Caroline caught the hint of pain in his voice, the slight tremor in his lower lip. "Nobody ever came looking for me?" The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. "Oh, but I did look for you," she wanted to cry out. "I never stopped looking. Every day for 10 years, I searched for your face in crowds, in photographs, in my dreams." "Mom?" Tommy's voice broke through her thoughts, sharp and clear. "Can we go play now?" "Of course," Caroline whispered, her voice barely audible. She watched them head toward Tommy's room, their footsteps echoing down the hallway, then practically ran to her bedroom, her legs weak beneath her. Her hands trembled as she pulled the old photo album from her bedside drawer. The leather cover was worn smooth from years of touching, of searching these pages for comfort on countless sleepless nights. She flipped it open, past the hospital photos, past Isaiah's first steps, until she found what she was looking for. Isaiah at 3 years old, captured in a moment of pure joy. The same dimpled smile, the same curve of the cheek, the same mischievous glint in those brown eyes that seemed to dance with life. She held up her phone, where she'd secretly snapped a photo of Malik earlier that morning. Side by side, they were mirror images so perfectly matched it took her breath away. From the hallway came the sound of Malik's laughter, that distinctive giggle that used to echo through this very house a decade ago, bouncing off these same walls. Caroline's hand flew to her mouth, stifling her gasp as tears pricked at her eyes. That laugh. She would know it anywhere. It was the same laugh that had haunted her dreams for 10 years, the soundtrack to both her happiest memories and her deepest sorrows. "I need to find out the truth," she whispered, her fingers tracing Isaiah's face in the photograph, feeling the glossy surface beneath her fingertip. Her heart raced with the weight of this revelation, with the possibility that her lost son might have finally found his way home, guided by some miracle she didn't dare to name. That night, Caroline's bedroom was illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of her laptop screen. The clock on her nightstand showed 2:37 a.m., but sleep was the furthest thing from her mind. Her fingers trembled as she typed "Missing Children Cases 2013" into the search bar, desperate to find any clues that could help solve the mystery of her long-lost son, Isaiah. Page after page of heartbreaking stories filled her screen, each one a painful reminder of the anguish she had endured. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, but she couldn't stop. She had to know the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. The police database access she'd gotten years ago during Isaiah's investigation was still active, and she clicked through dozens of case files, her heart racing with each new photo. Then she saw it, a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. On the screen was an age progression sketch of Isaiah, created by forensic artists 2 years ago. The resemblance to Malik, the young boy who had recently come into her life, was uncanny. The same gentle slope of the nose, the identical curve of the jawline, even the way the ears sat slightly forward. Caroline's breath caught in her throat, and tears splashed onto her keyboard as she whispered, "Oh my God." The next morning, running on just 2 hours of sleep, Caroline's hands shook as she dialed a number she hadn't called in years. After 3 rings, a gruff voice answered. "Ray Phillips speaking." "Ray, it's Caroline Lawson," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "I need your help. It's about Isaiah." In the kitchen, Tommy watched his mom pace back and forth while she talked on the phone. He'd never seen her like this, her hair uncombed, still in her pajamas at 7:30 a.m. She kept glancing at the clock, muttering about being late for school, but her focus was entirely on the conversation with Ray. "Mom?" Tommy called out, concerned. "Are you okay?" Caroline gave him a distracted nod, still listening intently to Ray's voice on the phone, her mind racing with the possibility that her long-lost son might be within her reach. Later that morning, after dropping the boys at school, Caroline sat at her desk during her free period, surrounded by printouts of old case files. Every detail about Isaiah's disappearance lined up perfectly with what she knew about Malik: the age when he was found, the timing, even the general location. The evidence was mounting, but she needed to be absolutely certain. She needed proof that no one could deny. She needed a DNA test. That afternoon, Malik sat at their kitchen table eating pancakes Caroline had made for an after-school snack. She watched as he reached for the syrup, pouring it in a specific pattern, making a smiley face just like Isaiah used to do. Malik paused, staring at his plate with a confused expression. "What's wrong?" Caroline asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Nothing," Malik said, shaking his head. "Just feels like I've done this before. Weird, right?" Caroline gripped her coffee mug so hard her knuckles turned white. The evidence was mounting, but she needed to be sure. She needed to know the truth, no matter how it might change their lives forever. "Everything okay, Mom?" Tommy asked, noticing how she hadn't touched her own pancakes. "Yes, sweetie," she managed to say, but her mind was already racing with plans to uncover the answers she so desperately needed. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across Caroline's coffee cup. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours, but adrenaline kept her alert. Her fingers drummed against the ceramic mug as she replayed last night's discoveries over and over in her mind, each detail burning brighter with each passing moment. "Mom, can we have pancakes?" Tommy's voice broke through her thoughts as he bounded into the kitchen, Malik trailing behind him. Both boys were already dressed for school, their backpacks slung over their shoulders. Tommy's shirt was slightly wrinkled and Malik's hair was still damp from his morning shower. "Sure, honey." Caroline's voice cracked slightly. She stood up, grateful for something to do with her trembling hands. As she mixed the batter, she couldn't help but watch Malik from the corner of her eye, her heart skipping a beat with each familiar movement. The boys sat at the table laughing about something that had happened in their video game the night before. Malik picked up his fork, holding it exactly the way Isaiah used to, slightly tilted to the left, middle finger curved underneath. Caroline nearly dropped the spatula, her breath catching in her throat. When Malik laughed at Tommy's joke, he tilted his head just so, exactly like Isaiah did in her memories. It wasn't just the physical resemblance anymore. It was in every little movement, every gesture, down to the way he absently tapped his foot against the table leg while he ate. After breakfast, Caroline drove the boys to school, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. As soon as they disappeared into the building, their backpacks bouncing with each step, she made a sharp turn away from her usual route home. 20 minutes later, she pulled into the police station parking lot, the familiar brick building looming before her. Detective Ray Phillips was waiting for her in the lobby. Though retired now, he still commanded respect in his pressed shirt and neatly combed gray hair. He'd been one of the first officers on Isaiah's case, and Caroline had always appreciated his dedication, even when the trail had gone cold. "I need your help," Caroline said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hands shook as she pulled out the stack of Isaiah's baby pictures from her purse, the edges worn from years of handling. In the small conference room, Caroline spread the photos across the table. Detective Phillips listened intently as she described Malik, the coincidences, the birthmark, the mannerisms. His eyes grew more focused with each detail she shared. "Show me what you found," Phillips said, turning to his laptop. He pulled up the old case files, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Side by side, they compared Isaiah's missing person report with Malik's foster care records, searching for connections. "Look at this," Phillips pointed to the screen. "Malik's records only start at age 3, found abandoned in Henderson Park." He frowned, leaning closer. "That's highly unusual. There should be some record of his existence before then. Birth certificate, medical record, something." His frown deepened as he scrolled through the sparse documentation. Caroline's heart thundered in her chest. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and dialed Angela Rivers' number, which she'd gotten from Tommy's school directory. The phone felt heavy in her hand as it rang. Angela answered on the third ring. Her voice was warm but cautious as Caroline introduced herself as Tommy's mother. They talked about the boys' friendship, and then Caroline carefully steered the conversation toward Malik's past, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, he came to me when he was 3, Angela confirmed. "Such a scared little thing. They found him alone in Henderson Park. No ID, no note, nothing. He wouldn't speak for weeks." Caroline's free hand clenched into a fist. Henderson Park was less than 2 miles from where Isaiah had disappeared. The timeline matched perfectly. It couldn't be coincidence, not anymore. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. As she ended the call, Caroline sat in her car staring at nothing. The steering wheel was cool under her tight grip. Everything pointed to one impossible, heart-wrenching possibility. She needed proof. She needed a DNA test. The weight of 9 years of searching pressed down on her shoulders as she contemplated her next move. Caroline's hands shook slightly as she stirred the pot of spaghetti sauce, the rich aroma of garlic and basil filling the kitchen. Her mind raced with possibilities as she watched Malik help Tommy set the table, placing plates and silverware with careful precision. The way Malik moved, the gentle way he handled each dish, it was so achingly familiar. Without thinking, Malik slid into the chair on the left side of the table, Isaiah's old spot. Caroline's breath caught in her throat. That had been Isaiah's favorite place, where he'd always insisted on sitting, claiming he could see the TV better from there. Even the way Malik tucked one leg underneath himself was exactly how Isaiah used to sit. "Thanks for helping, boys," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. The steam from the pasta made her eyes water. At least, that's what she told herself. As they began eating, Caroline gathered her courage. She had to know the truth, had to get proof before hope consumed her entirely. "Malik," she said, trying to sound casual, "would you mind helping me with a little project for work after dinner?" Malik looked up from his plate, marinara sauce dotting the corner of his mouth. His dark eyes met hers with that same questioning look she remembered so well. "What kind of project?" Caroline forced her hands to stay still as she reached for her water glass, the cool surface anchoring her to reality. "Just a little science experiment. All I need is a quick cheek swab." She smiled, hoping it looked natural. "I'm teaching my kindergarteners about DNA next week." Malik furrowed his brow, considering. "A cheek swab?" He wiped his mouth with his napkin. "Will it hurt?" "Not at all," Caroline assured him, her heart pounding so loud she was sure the boys could hear it. "It's just like running a Q-tip inside your cheek. Takes 2 seconds." "Sure, I guess." Malik shrugged, returning to his spaghetti. After dinner, Caroline's hands trembled as she opened the sterile swab package. Malik sat patiently in the kitchen chair, head tilted back slightly. The gesture was so familiar it made her heart ache. The kitchen light caught his profile, highlighting features she'd memorized in another little boy's face years ago. "Open wide," she said softly, and quickly ran the swab along the inside of his cheek. Her fingers shook as she sealed it in the sterile container. The small plastic tube felt impossibly heavy in her hand. Later that night, Caroline drove to the DNA testing center across town, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The fluorescent lights in the waiting room seemed too harsh, too real. A clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking each second that passed. "Results typically take 5 business days," the technician explained, typing information into her computer. She was young, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "We'll call you as soon as they're ready." 5 days. Caroline nodded numbly. 5 days that would feel like 5 years. Each minute would stretch like taffy, testing her patience and sanity. That night, sleep refused to come. Caroline tossed and turned, memories flooding her mind unbidden. Baby Isaiah's first steps, tottering across their living room floor with his arms outstretched toward her. His infectious giggle when she'd blow raspberries on his belly. The way he'd wrap his tiny arms around her neck, pressing wet kisses to her cheek and calling, "Mama, Mama." The scent of his baby shampoo, the feel of his warm weight in her arms. She jolted awake in a cold sweat, her pillow damp with tears. The digital clock on her nightstand read 3:47 a.m. Moonlight filtered through her curtains, casting strange shadows on the wall. The house felt too quiet, too empty, despite knowing both boys slept peacefully down the hall. Sitting up in bed, Caroline wrapped her arms around her knees. "Please," she whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible. "Please let it be him." The words hung in the air like a prayer, carrying 9 years of hope and heartache. Caroline sat at her kitchen table early Saturday morning, her third cup of coffee growing cold beside her laptop. She hadn't slept well for days, constantly checking her email for the DNA results. Every few hours she'd jolt awake, reach for her phone, and check again. The house was quiet. Tommy and Malik had gone to the park down the street to play basketball, their excited chatter and thundering footsteps fading away 20 minutes ago. Her hands trembled as she refreshed her inbox again, the familiar motion becoming almost mechanical after so many attempts. Suddenly, a new message appeared. "DNA results ready. Click to view." Caroline's heart leaped into her throat, and her stomach clenched with a mixture of terror and hope. She clicked the link, her vision blurring slightly as she entered her password with fumbling fingers. The page loaded agonizingly slowly, the spinning circle seeming to mock her desperation. When the results finally appeared, time seemed to stop, the kitchen around her fading away to nothing. 99.9% match. "Oh my God," Caroline whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh my God." The room began to spin, colors blending together like a watercolor painting left in the rain. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself as tears streamed down her face, hot and unstoppable. Her chest heaved with sobs that she couldn't control, each breath catching painfully in her throat. Years of grief, hope, and desperation crashed over her like a tidal wave, threatening to pull her under. "Isaiah," she choked out between sobs, the name feeling both foreign and achingly familiar on her tongue. "My baby, you're alive." She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to muffle the sound of her crying, not wanting the empty house to echo with her breakdown. The proof was right there on her screen, undeniable scientific confirmation. Malik was Isaiah. Her lost son had somehow found his way back home, like a miracle she'd stopped believing was possible. Caroline's whole body shook as she tried to process this earth-shattering revelation. She clutched the printed results to her chest, her tears leaving dark spots on the paper that spread like tiny ink blots. But as the initial shock began to fade, a new anxiety gripped her heart, squeezing until she could barely breathe. How could she tell him? How do you tell a 12-year-old boy that everything he thought he knew about himself wasn't true? That the very foundation of his identity was about to shift beneath his feet? Without thinking it through, Caroline grabbed her car keys, the metal biting into her palm. She had to see him right now, had to look at him knowing the truth. Her hands shook so badly she could barely start the car, missing the ignition twice before finally succeeding. The park was only 2 blocks away, familiar houses and trees blurring past her window. As she pulled into the parking lot, she could see Tommy and Malik playing basketball on the court, their movements quick and natural. They were laughing, carefree, unaware that their whole world was about to change forever. Malik noticed her first, his intuitive nature picking up on something wrong. He stopped mid-dribble, the basketball falling forgotten from his hands with a hollow bounce as he took in her tear-stained face and trembling form. His expression shifted from confusion to wariness, and he took an instinctive step backward, his shoulders tensing in that way she'd noticed whenever he felt threatened. Caroline stepped out of the car on shaky legs, her knees threatening to give out. "Malik!" she called out, her voice breaking on his name, the wrong name, she realized with a jolt. "I need to talk to you." Malik stood frozen on the basketball court, his eyes wide with uncertainty, his body language screaming that he wanted to run. The warm spring breeze carried the sound of bouncing basketballs and children's laughter across the park. But for Caroline, Tommy, and Malik, time seemed to freeze as they stood on the cracked concrete court. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across their faces, highlighting the tension that crackled between them like static electricity. Caroline's hands shook violently as she clutched the papers. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat echoing in her ears like a drum. There was no gentle way to say this. No perfect words existed for a moment like this. She'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times in her mind, but now all those practiced phrases dissolved like sugar in rain. "Malik," she started, her voice quivering. "You're my son." The words exploded in the air between them like a thunderclap. Tommy's basketball slipped from his fingers, bouncing away forgotten across the court with hollow thuds. Malik stood completely still, as if turned to stone, his dark eyes wide with shock. "What?" Tommy's voice cracked with disbelief, his face twisting with confusion and hurt. Malik's face drained of color, leaving his brown skin ashen. His shoulders tensed, and his hands curled into tight fists at his sides, knuckles turning white with pressure. "What are you talking about?" His voice came out barely above a whisper, trembling with uncertainty. Caroline held out the papers with trembling hands, the pages rustling in the breeze. I had a DNA test done. Look." She took a shaky step forward, her shoes scraping against the rough concrete. "You're Isaiah. My son who was taken from me when he was 3. Malik stared at the papers, his eyes scanning the numbers and percentages, moving back and forth like a trapped animal. His chest began to rise and fall rapidly, each breath becoming more shallow than the last. "No," he said, shaking his head so hard his curls bounced. "No, this isn't real." He backed away, his sneakers scraping against the concrete, leaving scuff marks in their wake. "I don't know you." Caroline reached for him instinctively, her mother's heart aching to hold him, to protect him from this pain. "Please, sweetheart." Malik flinched away from her touch as if it burned, stumbling backward. "Don't." His voice cracked with panic, breaking on that single syllable. Tommy suddenly turned and stormed away, kicking the forgotten basketball as hard as he could. It bounced off the chain-link fence with a metallic clang that seemed to echo across the empty court. Malik's breathing grew more erratic, coming in short, sharp gasps. His eyes darted around wildly, like a trapped animal looking for escape. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool breeze. "This isn't... I can't..." His whole body trembled like a leaf in a storm. "Please, just listen," Caroline begged, tears streaming down her face, leaving wet trails on her cheeks. "I know this is scary, but..." "No!" Malik shouted, shaking his head violently. His eyes were wide with fear and confusion, glistening with unshed tears. "No, no, no!" Before Caroline could say another word, Malik spun around and ran. His feet pounded against the pavement as he sprinted away from the basketball court, each step echoing like a gunshot in the suddenly silent park. "Malik!" Caroline screamed after him, her voice raw with desperation, the name tearing from her throat. "Please, Malik!" But he didn't stop. He didn't look back. He just ran faster, his figure growing smaller as he disappeared down the street, swallowed by the lengthening shadows of late afternoon. Caroline's legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed to her knees on the rough concrete, the DNA results fluttering from her hands like autumn leaves. Gut-wrenching sobs tore from her throat as she watched her son vanish from sight for the second time in her life, leaving behind nothing but the echo of running footsteps and the hollow bounce of an abandoned basketball. The streetlights flickered to life one by one as darkness settled over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across the empty sidewalks. A chilly autumn breeze rustled through the trees, sending dried leaves skittering across the pavement. Caroline paced frantically by her car, phone pressed tightly to her ear, leaving yet another message for Malik. Her voice cracked with desperation, her free hand running nervously through her hair, tangling in the strands that had long since escaped her usual neat ponytail. "Please, just let me know you're safe, that's all I'm asking. We can figure everything else out later, I promise." Tommy stood in the doorway, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, fingers digging into his sleeves so hard she could see the fabric bunching. His face was a storm of emotions, anger, confusion, hurt, all warring for dominance in his young features. The porch light caught the shimmer of unshed tears in his eyes. "Why did you have to say anything?" he muttered, his voice thick with accusation. "Everything was fine before. We were happy. Now it's all messed up." Caroline's chest ached at his words, but she couldn't focus on that now. She had to find Malik, her son. The thought made her breath catch in her throat. After all these years, to find him only to lose him again. It was unbearable. The weight of it pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe. She jumped into her car, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. The engine roared to life, and she pulled away from the curb, leaving Tommy standing alone in the doorway, his silhouette growing smaller in her rearview mirror. The sight of him there, alone and hurting, would haunt her later. But right now she could only think of finding Malik before something terrible happened. Where would he go? The question echoed relentlessly in her mind as she drove through familiar streets that now seemed strange and threatening in the growing darkness. Every shadow made her heart jump. Every moving figure caught her attention. She stopped at every park, every bus stop, every street corner, her voice growing hoarser with each inquiry. Have you seen a boy? 12 years old, wearing a gray hoodie? Dark hair about this tall? She held her hand up to demonstrate, fighting back tears. The answers were all the same, accompanied by sympathetic headshakes and concerned looks. No one had seen him. With shaking fingers, she dialed Angela Rivers' number. Malik's foster mother answered on the second ring, hope evident in her voice. Caroline could hear the worry underneath it, matching her own. "He's not here," Angela said, her voice tight with worry. "What happened, Caroline? He always comes home. He's never done anything like this before. He's such a good boy." Caroline couldn't bring herself to explain. Not yet, not over the phone. The truth was too big, too devastating. "If you hear from him..." "Of course. I'll call right away, the second I hear anything. Please find him, Caroline." Hours passed like centuries. The streets grew quieter, darker, more forbidding. Caroline's eyes burned with unshed tears as she turned down yet another empty street, her hope fading with each passing minute. Her gas tank was running low, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. Then her phone buzzed, making her jump. Her heart pounded as she fumbled to answer it. "Caroline?" Detective Phillips's gruff voice came through the speaker. "We've got a sighting, an abandoned playground on 7th Street. One of our patrols spotted a kid matching Malik's description about 10 minutes ago. He's alone, just sitting there." Caroline's heart leaped into her throat. "I'm on my way, please don't let him leave." She pressed down on the accelerator, watching the street signs blur past until she reached 7th Street. The playground was old, with rusty swings that creaked eerily in the night breeze. Paint peeled from the metal frames and weeds pushed through cracks in the asphalt. And there, illuminated by a single flickering streetlight, was a small figure sitting on one of the swings, exactly where the officer had said he'd be. Malik. His head was down, shoulders slumped in defeat, feet dragging listlessly in the wood chips beneath the swing. The hood of his sweatshirt was pulled up, but she could see his face in profile, tear-streaked and lost. He looked so small, so lost, so vulnerable. Caroline's heart broke all over again at the sight. She stepped forward carefully, gravel crunching under her feet in the stillness of the night. "Malik," she called softly, her voice gentle and pleading. "Please, let me talk to you. Just talk to me. Whatever you're feeling, we can work through it together." The metal chains of the swing creaked softly as Malik rocked back and forth, his hoodie pulled low over his face. His sneakers dragged through the wood chips, leaving small furrows in their wake. Caroline's footsteps crunched on the wood chips as she approached, her heart pounding with each step. The playground stood empty except for them, the evening air heavy with unspoken words. A gentle breeze rustled through the nearby trees, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. Caroline knelt beside the swing, her hands clasped tightly to keep them from shaking. The damp wood chips soaked through her jeans, but she barely noticed. "I know this is a lot," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle squeaking of the swing chains. Malik's fists clenched around the metal links until his knuckles turned white. "I don't remember you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. A single tear rolled down his cheek, quickly wiped away. The words hit Caroline like physical blows, but she forced herself to stay steady, drawing on years of practiced strength. "That's okay," she managed, fighting back tears. Her throat felt tight, constricted with emotion. "We can make new memories." Malik sniffed, quickly rubbing his eyes with his sleeve. The fabric of his hoodie was soft and worn, a shield against the world. "Why didn't you find me sooner?" The question came out broken, filled with years of loneliness and confusion. His shoulders hunched forward, making him look smaller than his 12 years. Caroline's chest tightened painfully, her heart aching with the weight of lost time. "I never stopped looking," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not for a single day, not for one moment." With trembling hands, she pulled out an old photograph from her pocket. The edges were worn soft from years of handling, the corners rounded and fuzzy. In it, a chubby-cheeked baby smiled at the camera, the same distinctive birthmark visible behind his ear. The photo was slightly faded, but the joy in the baby's eyes remained crystal clear. "You were my whole world," Caroline said softly, holding out the photo. Her fingers shook slightly as she extended it toward him. "And I lost you." Her voice cracked on the last words, years of grief bleeding through. Malik stared at the picture, his breathing uneven. His fingers twitched, wanting to reach for it but holding back. She could see the struggle in his face, wanting to believe but afraid to hope. The truth was there in the photograph, but accepting it meant facing years of questions and pain. His eyes darted between the photo and Caroline's face, searching for answers. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both look up. Tommy stood a few feet away, his hands stuffed in his pockets, uncertainty written across his face. His school backpack hung from one shoulder, forgotten in the moment. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, caught between staying and running, his sneakers scuffing against the ground. Caroline slowly extended her hand toward Malik, palm up. An invitation, not a demand. Her heart thundered in her chest. "Please," she whispered, "come home." For a long moment, only the creaking of the swing chains broke the silence. The evening shadows grew longer around them. Then, slowly, Malik's hand moved toward hers. His fingers were cold as they touched her palm, but they carried the warmth of hope. Tommy released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Together, they walked toward home, their footsteps falling into rhythm on the quiet street. The setting sun painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks, a new day fading into tomorrow. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was a start. A first step on the long road to becoming a family again. The metal chains creaked softly in the evening air, as Malik rocked back and forth on the swing, his hoodie pulled low over his face, hiding his expression. The playground stood empty and quiet around them, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows. A gentle breeze rustled through nearby trees, carrying with it the faint scent of autumn leaves. Caroline approached carefully, her heart aching at the sight of her son trying to hide from the world, from her. She knelt beside the swing, the wood chips crunching beneath her knees. Her hands trembled as she steadied herself, searching for the right words to say. "I know this is a lot," she whispered, her voice gentle and hesitant. "It's a lot for me, too." Malik's fingers tightened around the swing chains until his knuckles turned white, his body tense. "I don't remember you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, barely above a whisper. The words pierced Caroline's heart, but she forced herself to stay strong, to not let the tears fall just yet. "That's okay," she managed, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. "We can make new memories together." Malik sniffed and quickly rubbed his eyes with his sleeve, trying to hide the tears that had begun to form. "Why didn't you find me sooner?" The question came out broken, years of pain and loneliness evident in every word. Caroline's chest tightened painfully, the weight of her son's words pressing down on her. "I never stopped looking," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not for a single day, Malik. I never gave up on finding you." With shaking hands, she pulled out an old photograph from her pocket. The edges were worn soft from years of handling, the colors slightly faded. In it, a chubby-cheeked baby smiled at the camera, the same distinctive birthmark visible behind his ear. "You were my whole world," Caroline said softly, holding out the photo to Malik. "And I lost you." Her voice cracked on the last words, the pain of those years without him echoing in her voice. Malik stared at the picture, his breathing uneven. She could see the internal struggle playing across his face, wanting to believe but terrified to hope. The evidence was there in the photograph, but accepting it meant facing years of unanswered questions and buried pain. The sound of footsteps made them both look up. Tommy stood a few feet away, hands stuffed in his pockets, uncertainty written across his face. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly unsure of his place in this moment, of how to be a part of this fragile reunion. Caroline extended her hand toward Malik, her palm open in invitation. "Please," she whispered, "come home with us. Let's start healing together." For a long moment, Malik just stared at her outstretched hand. Then slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and placed his hand in hers. Caroline's heart swelled with a mix of relief and joy as she felt his hand in hers, the first step in their long journey back to each other. Tommy released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Together, the three of them began walking home, taking their first steps toward healing as a family. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and emotions yet to be faced, but in that moment, they were together, and that was enough. Angela pulled Malik into a hug as soon as he appeared at her doorstep, but his body went rigid at her touch. She noticed his red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands, leading him gently to the familiar brown couch in her living room. The same couch where they'd spent countless evenings watching movies and sharing stories, where she'd comforted him through nightmares and celebrated his achievements. "Here," she said softly, handing him a glass of water. "Take deep breaths. Just like we practiced when you were younger, remember?" Malik stared at the glass, his reflection distorted in the water's surface. The weight of everything pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. The living room felt different now, both comforting and strange at the same time, like a favorite sweater that didn't quite fit anymore. The family photos on the wall seemed to watch him, their frozen smiles holding secrets he never knew existed. "She says she's my mom," he finally whispered, his voice cracking. "But I don't remember her. I don't remember anything before coming here. It's all just blank." Angela's face softened with pain and understanding. She reached for his hand, but stopped halfway, giving him space. Her heart ached seeing him so lost. "I always knew this might happen one day," she admitted quietly. "When they found you in that park, there were so many questions, so many things that didn't add up." Malik looked up at her, eyes wide with confusion and hurt. His fingers tightened around the glass. "What am I supposed to do?" "Listen to me," Angela said, her voice gentle but firm, though her own heart was breaking. "You don't have to choose between us. Love doesn't work that way. But you do have to decide where you belong. And whatever you choose, I'll always be here for you." The hours ticked by as Malik sat in Angela's living room, trying to make sense of his world turning upside down. The familiar ticking of the old wall clock, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the slight squeak of the floorboards under his feet. Everything that had meant home now felt different. Each sound seemed to echo with new meaning, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Angela's phone rang, breaking the heavy silence. Caroline's name flashed on the screen. Angela stepped into the kitchen to answer it, but Malik could still hear the worry in Caroline's voice, the maternal concern that now felt both foreign and familiar. "He's safe," Angela assured her, keeping her voice steady despite her own turmoil. "But I think he needs time. This isn't easy for any of us." Malik could hear Caroline's shaky breath through the phone, could almost feel her holding back tears. It made his stomach twist with guilt and confusion. Two mothers, both hurting because of him. Later, lying in Angela's guest room, the same room he'd stayed in countless times before, Malik stared at the ceiling. The glow-in-the-dark stars he'd stuck up there years ago still shone faintly, arranged in patterns he'd created during happier, simpler times. He'd always imagined they were guiding him home, but now he wasn't sure where home was anymore. Some of the stars had started to peel at the edges, much like how his sense of belonging was slowly coming undone. The ceiling offered no answers. He felt caught between two worlds, the life he knew with Angela and the life he should have had with Caroline. Neither felt completely right or completely wrong. He just felt lost, adrift between two families, two identities, two versions of himself. The boy he was and the boy he might have been seemed to exist simultaneously, neither one fully real, neither one fully false. The night air felt heavy as Caroline's fingers hovered over her phone. She'd already dialed Angela's number 3 times, hanging up before it could ring. Her living room felt too quiet, too empty without Malik's presence. The ticking of the wall clock seemed to mock her indecision. Tommy had locked himself in his room, refusing to talk about what happened, and she could hear his muffled music through the walls. Finally, gathering her courage, she pressed call. Her heart pounded with each ring. The phone rang twice before Angela answered. "Can I come over?" Caroline's voice trembled. "Please, I need to see him. I need to make this right." There was a long pause on the other end, filled with static and unspoken tension. "All right," Angela said finally, her tone careful and measured. "But Caroline, he's very upset. He hasn't said a word since he got home." The drive seemed endless. Streetlights blurred past as Caroline gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white against the leather. She couldn't lose him again. Not after finally finding him. The thought of him slipping away made her chest ache with a familiar, devastating pain she thought she'd never have to feel again. Angela stood in the doorway when Caroline arrived, her arms crossed protectively over her chest, her face lined with worry. From the shadowy hallway behind her, Malik watched with wary eyes, half hidden like a frightened animal. His shoulders were hunched, making him look smaller than his 12 years. "He's confused, Caroline," Angela said softly but firmly, shifting her weight to block the entrance. "He doesn't know where he belongs. This is all happening so fast for him." Caroline's throat tightened. "He belongs with me. I'm his mother." The words came out more desperate than she intended. "You can't just expect him to jump into your arms," Angela countered, her voice rising with emotion. "He's been with me for years. I've been there through everything, every nightmare, every scraped knee, every school play, every single moment that made him who he is." "I would have been there." Caroline's voice cracked with emotion, tears welling in her eyes. "If someone hadn't taken him from me, I never stopped looking. Never. Do you know what it's like to lose your child? To wake up every morning wondering if they're safe, if they're loved? And do you know what it's like to raise one?" Angela shot back, her own eyes glistening. "To be there every single day, to watch him grow, to hold him when he cries, to—" "Stop it." Both women froze at Malik's sudden outburst. He stood in the hallway now, hands clenched into fists, tears streaming down his face. His whole body trembled with emotion. "Just stop. I can't breathe. Everyone's fighting over me like I'm some kind of prize to win." His voice broke, raw with pain. "I just want to breathe. I just want to think without everyone telling me who I am." Before either woman could respond, Malik yanked open the front door and slammed it behind him, disappearing into the darkness. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. Caroline and Angela stood in shocked silence, the echo of the slam still ringing in their ears. They looked at each other, the anger draining from their faces as they realized what they'd done. Their fight had only pushed him further away, their love turning into a weapon that hurt the very person they were trying to protect. Through the window, they could see Malik's figure running down the street, getting smaller and smaller until he vanished into the night. Both women felt the weight of their mistakes settling heavily on their shoulders, their shared fear for him momentarily bridging the gulf between them. Caroline dragged herself through her front door, her body heavy with exhaustion. She hadn't slept all night, spending hours driving around looking for Malik after he ran. Her eyes burned, and her hands still trembled from too much gas station coffee. The morning sun streaming through the windows felt too bright, too cheerful for how she felt inside. Tommy stood in the living room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face was red, and his eyes were puffy. He'd been crying. The TV remote lay on the floor, as if he'd thrown it in anger. "Where were you all night?" he demanded, his voice rough. His fingers dug into his arms, knuckles white with tension. "I was looking for Malik," Caroline said softly, setting her keys down with shaking hands. "He ran off and—" "Of course you were," Tommy cut her off, his words sharp with bitterness. His lip quivered as he spoke. "Why can't you just leave him alone?" Caroline stared at her son, taken aback by the venom in his voice. Her throat tightened at the pain in his eyes. "Tommy, I'm trying to bring our family back together. He's your brother." "No." Tommy's voice cracked. He scoffed, fresh tears welling in his eyes, making them shine in the morning light. "You don't get it, do you? He doesn't even want us." "That's not true," Caroline whispered, her heart breaking at Tommy's words. She took a step toward him, but he backed away. "He's just confused and scared." "It is true," Tommy shouted, his whole body trembling. A tear rolled down his cheek, but he angrily wiped it away. "It's true, and you're too busy chasing him to see it. I'm sick of waiting for a brother who doesn't want to be here." His voice broke on the last word, tears spilling down his cheeks. Before Caroline could reach for him, Tommy spun around and stormed off to his room. The slam of his door echoed through the house like a gunshot, rattling the family photos on the walls. Caroline stood frozen in the middle of her kitchen, her legs barely holding her up. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just losing Malik, she was losing Tommy too. In her desperate attempt to reconnect with one son, she was pushing away the other. She sank into a kitchen chair, burying her face in her hands. The house felt impossibly quiet, empty. The ticking of the kitchen clock seemed to mock her with each passing second. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? Just a week ago, her life had made sense. Now it felt like she was watching her family crumble through her fingers like sand. A heavy silence settled over the house, broken only by the distant sound of Tommy's muffled sobs. The morning sun cast long shadows across the kitchen floor, and Caroline had never felt more alone. The digital clock on the nightstand blinked 11:42 p.m. as Malik sat cross-legged on the guest bed at Angela's house. His worn backpack lay beside him, stuffed with clothes and his few precious belongings. The sketchbook he never showed anyone, a lucky penny he'd found years ago, and the small stuffed dog Angela had given him on his first night with her. The house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the heating system and the distant sound of a car passing on the street outside. He picked up the photo Caroline had given him, the one of him as a baby. His chest felt tight as he stared at it, his fingers leaving smudges on the glossy surface. The little boy in the picture was a stranger, with bright eyes and a toothless smile. That wasn't him, it couldn't be. Malik shoved the photo into his backpack and zipped it shut. The sound seemed too loud in the silent room, making him wince. He couldn't stay here anymore. Not with Angela looking at him with sad eyes, like she was already saying goodbye. And definitely not with Caroline, who watched his every move like she was afraid he'd disappear again, who kept trying to share memories he didn't have. His hands trembled as he pulled on his hoodie, the one he'd worn so many times the cuffs were starting to fray. The familiar fabric felt comforting, like armor against the world. He slipped his feet into his sneakers, not bothering to tie the laces. The worn soles barely made a sound on the carpet. The floor creaked under his weight as he crept toward the door. His heart pounded so hard he was sure someone would hear it echoing through the quiet house. Just a few more steps to freedom. "Where are you going?" Malik froze, his muscles tensing like a startled deer. Angela stood in the hallway, her arms wrapped around herself. She wore her old blue robe, the one she always put on when she stayed up late reading, the soft fabric catching the dim light from the nightlight in the hall. His throat felt dry as sandpaper. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. The weight of her gaze held him in place. Angela's expression softened as she looked at him, the worry lines around her eyes deepening into familiar channels of concern. "You don't have to leave, sweetheart." Malik's eyes burned with tears he refused to let fall. He shook his head, gripping his backpack strap tighter until his knuckles turned white. "I don't know how to stay," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "Everyone wants something from me. Everyone wants me to be someone else." Angela took a step forward, then stopped when she saw him tense like a cornered animal. She sighed, a deep sound full of understanding and pain that seemed to fill the narrow hallway. "If you really want to go, I won't stop you." She paused, then added gently, her voice barely above a whisper, "But you need to tell Caroline." Malik's stomach twisted at the thought like someone had tied it in knots. He couldn't face Caroline, couldn't bear to see the hurt in her eyes, the desperate hope that made him feel like he was suffocating under the weight of expectations he could never meet. "I can't," he said, his voice barely audible, breaking on the last word. Angela didn't try to argue. She just stood there, watching him with eyes that had always seen him for who he was. Not Isaiah, not someone's lost son. Just Malik. The boy who liked to draw in secret and who always helped with the dishes without being asked. He turned away, unable to look at her anymore. His feet carried him to the front door. Each step felt heavy, like his shoes were filled with lead, pulling him down even as they moved him forward. The night air hit his face as he stepped outside, carrying the scent of wet grass and approaching rain. It was cold, but he welcomed the chill. At least it was something real, something he could feel, something that didn't come with expectations or memories he couldn't remember. He started walking, not knowing where he was going. He just knew he couldn't stay. The streetlights cast long shadows ahead of him as he disappeared into the darkness. The streetlights cast long shadows as Malik walked aimlessly through the quiet neighborhood. His backpack felt heavy on his shoulders, and his feet ached from walking. The night air had grown chilly, making him pull his hoodie tighter around himself. A few cars passed by slowly, their headlights briefly illuminating his path before leaving him in darkness again. After hours of wandering, he found himself in front of the local youth shelter. The building looked old, but welcoming, with warm light spilling from its windows onto the cracked sidewalk below. A weathered sign hung above the door, its paint peeling at the edges. Malik slumped down on the concrete steps, too tired to keep walking, his muscles protesting every movement. An older man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes stepped outside. He wore a name tag that read, "Mr. Rodriguez," and carried 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate. His worn sweater and comfortable shoes spoke of someone who spent long hours helping others. "Rough night?" Mr. Rodriguez asked softly, offering Malik one of the cups. His voice carried the warmth of someone who had comforted countless troubled youth before. Malik nodded but stayed quiet, wrapping his cold fingers around the warm cup. The sweet smell of chocolate made his stomach growl, reminding him he hadn't eaten since lunch. Mr. Rodriguez settled beside him on the steps, leaving enough space so Malik wouldn't feel crowded. His movements were careful, practiced. "I've seen that look before. Been seeing it for 20 years now." "What look?" Malik glanced up, curious despite himself, his fingers tapping nervously against the cup. "The look of a boy who thinks he has nowhere to go." Mr. Rodriguez's voice was gentle, understanding. "I've worked here long enough to recognize it, seen it too many times to count." Malik stared into his hot chocolate, watching the steam rise in delicate swirls. The words he'd been holding back suddenly spilled out like a dam breaking. "I don't belong anywhere. Everything's all mixed up now." Mr. Rodriguez shook his head slowly, his eyes reflecting years of wisdom. "That's not true. Family isn't about where you came from. It's about who you choose to walk into the future with. Sometimes the hardest part is letting yourself be chosen too." The words hit Malik hard. His throat felt tight as he thought about Angela, who had loved him like her own for years, who still packed his favorite snacks in his lunch. About Caroline, who had never stopped searching for him, whose eyes lit up every time she saw him. About Tommy, who had been his best friend before everything got complicated, who still sometimes looked at him like a brother. "Who do I choose?" Malik whispered, more to himself than to Mr. Rodriguez. His voice trembled with uncertainty. The old man didn't answer right away, letting Malik sit with his thoughts. The street was quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. A cat prowled along the fence across the street, its eyes glowing in the darkness. Malik closed his eyes and took a deep breath, the warm cup steady in his hands. The answer was there, waiting for him. He knew where he needed to go. Sometimes home wasn't a place. It was the people who made your heart feel full. The living room was dimly lit by a single lamp as Caroline sat on the edge of the couch, her eyes fixed on the front door. Every car that passed made her heart jump, each set of headlights sweeping across the walls, raising her hopes only to dash them seconds later. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking each moment of waiting. Tommy's footsteps creaked softly upstairs. He was supposed to be sleeping, but she knew he was just as anxious as she was. She could picture him pacing, probably wearing a path in his carpet. The house felt impossibly empty, filled with memories that seemed to echo off the walls. Family photos smiled down at her from their frames, capturing happier times, moments frozen in the past. The familiar faces seemed to watch her, waiting alongside her in the quiet darkness. When the soft knock finally came, it was so quiet she almost missed it. Caroline's heart stopped. For a moment she couldn't move, afraid that if she did, the sound would turn out to be her imagination. Then came another gentle tap, slightly more insistent this time, and her breath caught in her throat. She rushed to the door, her hands trembling as she turned the handle. There stood Malik, his hands buried deep in his hoodie pockets, shoulders hunched against the night air. His eyes met hers briefly before dropping to the ground, his dark lashes casting shadows on his cheeks. Behind him, the streetlight cast a gentle glow, making him look younger, more vulnerable. She could see him shivering slightly, though whether from cold or nerves she couldn't tell. Movement at the top of the stairs caught her attention. Tommy stood there in his pajamas, gripping the banister, barely breathing. His knuckles were white against the dark wood. The three of them frozen in this moment, none sure how to break the silence that seemed to stretch between them like a fragile thread. "I. Malik's voice came out barely above a whisper, rough with emotion. His fingers fidgeted with the hem of his hoodie. "I don't know how to do this." Caroline felt tears welling up but forced them back, swallowing hard against the lump in her throat. "You just did," she said softly, stepping aside to give him space to enter. She didn't reach for him, didn't try to pull him into a hug no matter how much she wanted to. Her hands ached with the effort of holding herself back. Tommy remained at the top of the stairs watching. His expression was guarded, but he didn't storm off to his room. He stayed, waiting, hoping, though he tried not to show it. His feet shifted uncertainly on the carpet, but he held his ground. Malik took a deep breath that seemed to shake his whole body. Then, slowly, he stepped over the threshold. His sneakers made no sound on the hardwood floor, worn rubber soles moving cautiously across the surface. Caroline closed the door behind him with a quiet click that seemed to echo in the silence. He stood in the entryway looking around as if seeing it for the first time, or perhaps remembering it from long ago. His eyes traveled over the furniture, the decorations, finally landing on the photos hanging on the wall. Some were recent, showing Tommy growing up, but others were older. Much older. His gaze lingered on one particular frame, where a small boy with his same dark eyes smiled at the camera. "It looks..." Malik paused, his voice thick with emotion, one hand reaching out to touch the wall before dropping back to his side. "It looks the same." Caroline's response was gentle, filled with years of waiting and hope, her words carrying the weight of countless nights spent imagining this very moment. "It was always waiting for you." Sunlight filtered through the curtains of the guest room, casting warm patterns on the wall. Malik blinked awake, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. The bed was softer than he was used to, and the room smelled like fresh laundry and something sweet he couldn't quite place. For a moment, panic gripped his chest, but it passed quickly. This time, the room didn't feel like it was closing in on him. Instead, it felt almost welcoming. He could hear movement downstairs, pots clanking, water running, the quiet hum of morning routine. The scent of pancakes wafted up, making his stomach growl. Something about that smell tugged at the edges of his memory, like a dream he couldn't quite remember but knew he'd had before. In the kitchen, Caroline stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with practiced ease, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail. Tommy sat at the table, poking at his orange juice with a straw, creating tiny whirlpools in his glass. When Malik appeared in the doorway, both of them tried to act natural, but their quick glances gave them away. Caroline's spatula paused mid-flip, and Tommy's straw stopped moving. "Good morning," Caroline said softly, placing a stack of golden brown pancakes on the table. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the syrup, the bottle making a quiet thunk against the wooden surface. Tommy mumbled a quiet morning without looking up, his shoulders hunched forward. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the scraping of forks against plates and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. Malik took a bite of pancake and something stirred in his chest. The pancakes taste familiar, he said, surprising himself. The words had tumbled out before he could stop them. Caroline's face lit up, though she tried to contain her excitement. Her eyes sparkled with unshed tears. "It was your favorite," she replied, her voice gentle. "You used to ask for them every Sunday, with extra butter and maple syrup." Tommy pushed his food around his plate, creating abstract patterns with the syrup, but his shoulders weren't as tense as before. After a few minutes, he looked up at Malik and said, "Yeah, well, don't get used to it. Mom only makes them when she's trying to impress someone." There was a hint of teasing in his voice. A small smirk tugged at Malik's lips, the first in days. Caroline let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, her hand unconsciously reaching for the counter to steady herself. The rest of breakfast passed in a more comfortable silence. They weren't talking much, but the air felt lighter somehow, like clouds parting after a storm. Caroline watched them carefully, hope blooming in her chest even as she reminded herself to be patient. This would take time. These small moments were precious seeds that needed gentle tending. When the plates were cleared, Tommy stood up, hesitating for a moment before heading toward his room. His feet shuffled against the floor, as if unsure whether to move forward or back. Malik followed, his steps uncertain but determined. In Tommy's room, they sat in silence for what felt like ages. Gaming posters covered the walls, and a tangled mess of controllers lay by the TV like colorful spaghetti. The room smelled of boy, a mix of sneakers and whatever spray Tommy used to cover up the sneaker smell. Finally, Tommy reached over and grabbed one controller, tossing it to Malik. "You still remember how to play?" Tommy asked, his voice careful but not unkind. There was something like hope in his question. Malik looked down at the controller in his hands, turning it over slowly. The buttons felt familiar under his fingertips, like an old friend he hadn't seen in years. He nodded. "Let's find out." A week drifted by like autumn leaves, each day bringing small changes to the Lawson household. Malik's presence became less awkward, more natural, though everyone still walked on eggshells. His backpack found a permanent spot by the front door, and his shoes lined up neatly next to Tommy's messy pile. Even his toothbrush in the bathroom, bright green against the white holder, seemed to declare, "I belong here." At the mall, Caroline watched as Malik hesitantly touched the sleeve of a blue sweater. His current clothes were worn thin, with holes in the knees of his jeans and frayed cuffs that spoke of too many washings. "Go ahead, try it on," Caroline encouraged, picking up the sweater in his size. Malik's shoulders tensed, his fingers curling into his palms. "You don't have to do this." "I want to," Caroline replied softly, her heart aching at his discomfort with receiving gifts. She remembered how Isaiah used to twirl with joy at new clothes. At school, things felt almost normal. Tommy and Malik fell back into their easy friendship, sharing jokes during lunch and partnering up for class projects. They developed a routine of meeting by the water fountain between periods, trading snacks from their lunch boxes. But there were moments when the weight of their new reality pressed down on them like a heavy blanket. One afternoon, Caroline reached out to squeeze Malik's shoulder after he showed her his math test, a solid B+ marked in red at the top. He flinched away instinctively, then looked mortified, his cheeks burning with shame. Caroline pretended not to notice, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she busied herself with dinner preparations. The weekend brought sunshine and the promise of normalcy. Tommy bounced on his heels, football tucked under his arm, his sneakers already dusty from the yard. "Come on," There's a game at the park." Malik hesitated, glancing at Caroline, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his new sweater. "Go," she smiled, waving them off. "Have fun." The boys raced around the field, their laughter carrying on the breeze. For a while, everything felt perfect, the autumn air crisp and clean. Then it happened. "Isaiah, catch!" Tommy called out, throwing the ball in a perfect spiral. The word hung in the air like static before a storm. Malik caught the ball but stood frozen, his face unreadable, fingers gripping the leather too tight. "That's not my name," he said quietly, his voice steady but firm, each word carefully measured. Tommy's face flushed red, his freckles standing out against his skin. "Sorry, I didn't mean to." The moment stretched like taffy, uncomfortable but not breaking. Then Malik tossed the ball back, and they kept playing, though their movements were more careful now, as if the ground beneath them had somehow shifted. That evening, Caroline paused outside Malik's room. The door was cracked open, letting in a sliver of hallway light. She could see him lying there, hands folded on his chest, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun lazily above, casting gentle shadows across his face. "Good night, baby," she whispered, her words barely a breath. Malik didn't respond, but he didn't tense up either. He simply closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him like a gentle wave, perhaps allowing himself, just for a moment, to feel what it meant to be someone's child again. The kitchen was quiet except for the gentle clink of dishes and running water as Caroline washed up after dinner. The TV murmured softly from the living room where Tommy and Malik sat watching their favorite show, their silhouettes illuminated by the flickering screen. It almost felt normal, peaceful even, like any other ordinary evening in any other ordinary home. Then came the knock. Caroline's hands stilled in the soapy water, a half-cleaned plate slipping beneath the surface. She wasn't expecting anyone at this hour. Malik and Tommy looked up from the couch, their faces curious, the show momentarily forgotten. Wiping her hands on a worn dish towel, Caroline walked to the door, her heart picking up speed with each step across the hardwood floor. When she opened it, Angela Rivers stood on the porch, her face carefully composed beneath the porch light. The sight of her made Caroline's stomach twist with anxiety, a familiar knot of worry forming deep inside. Malik had gone rigid on the couch, his fingers digging into the cushions, knuckles white with tension. Tommy glanced between them all, sensing the sudden tension in the room like a static charge before a storm. "We need to talk," Angela said quietly, her voice steady but her eyes betraying her emotion, swimming with unspoken words. Caroline nodded slowly, stepping aside to let her in. "Of course." The words felt thick in her throat. Angela's eyes found Malik immediately, drawn to him like a compass finding north. "Could we speak privately?" Caroline wanted to say no. Every maternal instinct screamed to protect him, to keep him close, to shield him from whatever was coming. But she forced herself to nod. "You can use the study." Malik followed Angela down the hallway, his shoulders tense, each step measured and hesitant. The door clicked shut behind them with a sound that seemed too final. "I know this is hard," Angela began gently, settling into one of the leather chairs. "And I want you to know that it's okay. All of it." Malik stared at his hands, fingers twisting together in his lap. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I feel torn, like I'm being pulled in two directions." "You don't have to feel guilty for choosing them," Angela said softly, leaning forward. "They're your family, your blood." "But so are you," Malik whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "You took care of me when no one else would. You were there for everything." "I did," Angela agreed, her own eyes growing misty. "And I'll always love you, sweetheart. But you don't have to choose between loving them and caring about me. There's room in your heart for both. Love doesn't divide, it multiplies." Malik swallowed hard, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. I don't know where I belong anymore." Angela placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, squeezing softly. "Wherever you choose, Just know you were always loved. That will never change." When they emerged from the study, Tommy was pretending to watch TV while clearly straining to hear what was happening, his head tilted slightly toward the hallway. Caroline stood in the kitchen doorway, trying not to hover but unable to stay away, her hands twisted in her apron. Angela hugged Malik tightly, holding him close for a long moment before letting go, as if memorizing the feeling. He watched as she walked to the door, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Tommy nudged him gently with an elbow. "You okay?" Malik nodded slowly, his voice quiet but steady. "I think so." The words held both uncertainty and hope. The afternoon sun filtered through the living room windows, casting long shadows across the carpet. Malik stood in the center of the room, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as Caroline and Angela watched him from opposite sides of the room. Tommy lingered near the doorway, his expression unreadable. Angela was the first to move, gently guiding Malik to sit beside her on the couch. Her eyes were soft, filled with understanding that made Malik's chest ache. "You don't have to choose, Malik," she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "You'll always be my son." Tears welled up in Malik's eyes as he absorbed her words. 9 years of memories with Angela flooded his mind. Scraped knees she had bandaged, nightmares she had soothed, countless moments of unconditional love. Caroline stepped into the room then, her own eyes glistening. She moved slowly, as if afraid of startling him. "I never stopped looking for you," she said, her voice cracking. "I never gave up on you, not for a single day." The weight of their love pressed down on Malik's shoulders. Both women represented different parts of his life. Angela, the safety and stability he had known, and Caroline, the missing piece of his past that had finally been found. Caroline knelt in front of him, taking his trembling hands in hers. "Wherever you go, I'll be with you," she whispered, her thumbs rubbing gentle circles on his palms. It was too much. The pressure of their expectations, their love, their hope, it all crashed over him like a wave. Malik pulled his hands away and bolted for the backyard, needing air, needing space, needing to think. The grass was cool under his feet as he paced. Through the window he could see Tommy watching him, concern etched on his face. After a moment's hesitation, Tommy stepped outside, hands shoved deep in his pockets. Malik's breath came in short gasps as tears streamed down his face. "I don't know what to do," he whispered into the gathering darkness, his words carried away by the evening breeze. Caroline stood at the back door, watching her son disappear into the night. Every instinct told her to run after him, but she remained still, knowing this was a choice only he could make. The streetlights cast long shadows as Malik wandered through the quiet neighborhood. His footsteps echoed against the pavement, each step taking him further from both homes, the one he'd known for years with Angela, and the new one with Caroline and Tommy. The night air bit at his cheeks, but he barely noticed, too lost in the storm of thoughts swirling through his mind. He passed familiar landmarks, the corner store where he'd bought candy with Tommy, the bus stop where he'd waited countless mornings for school. Everything felt different now, colored by the weight of his newfound identity. Without meaning to, his feet carried him to the old playground where his story began. The rusty swings creaked in the night breeze, a sound that sent chills down his spine. This was where the police had found him at age 3, confused, alone, and scared. Malik sat on one of the swings, letting his feet drag in the wood chips below. Fragments of memories flickered through his mind like an old movie. A woman's voice singing softly, the sound of warm laughter, someone calling him Isaiah. The memories felt distant, like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. "Rough night, son," a gentle voice broke through his thoughts. Malik looked up to find an older man standing nearby. His weathered face held kindness, and something in his eyes made Malik feel safe. The man introduced himself as Mr. Rodriguez and sat on the swing beside him, not pushing for conversation, just offering quiet company. After a while, Mr. Rodriguez spoke again. "You know, I lost my son years ago." His voice was soft, tinged with old pain. Spent years trapped between what was and what could have been. But I learned something important. Family isn't about the past, it's about the future. Malik's fingers tightened around the swing chains. I don't know where I belong, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. You'll know when you choose. The belonging comes after the choice, not before. The words settled into Malik's chest, bringing with them a small measure of clarity. He looked up at the stars twinkling above, their steady light offering a strange comfort. For the first time in weeks, his mind felt clear. I'm coming home, he whispered to the night sky, the decision finally made. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the front porch as Malik stood there, his backpack hanging from one shoulder. His heart pounded against his ribs as he raised his hand to knock. The sound was soft, hesitant, but Caroline heard it immediately. She opened the door slowly, her eyes filled with uncertainty and hope. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between them. I'm ready to come home, Malik said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to float in the air, delicate and precious. Caroline's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she gripped the doorframe, tears already welling in her eyes. She wanted to rush forward, to wrap him in her arms, but she held back, giving him space. The creak of the stairs announced Tommy's presence. He stood there, frozen mid-step, his eyes wide with surprise. His gaze darted between Malik and his mom, trying to understand what was happening. Malik shifted his weight, then looked directly at them both. I want to be with you. Both of you. The words came out stronger now, more certain. Tommy's face broke into a wide grin. Before anyone could say anything else, he bounded down the remaining stairs and pulled Malik into a tight hug. Malik stiffened for a moment, then relaxed, returning the embrace. Caroline couldn't hold back anymore. Tears streamed down her face as she watched her boys, both of them, finally together. I never stopped loving you, she choked out through her tears. I never gave up. Tommy pulled back slightly, his own emotions clear on his face. Does this mean we're brothers again? There was a hint of vulnerability in his voice, a need for confirmation. Malik smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Yeah, I think so. The words seemed to lift a weight from all of them. They moved to the kitchen where morning light streamed through the windows. Caroline started making pancakes, the same recipe she'd used when Malik was little. The familiar scent filled the house as the boys sat at the table. Tommy and Malik fell into easy conversation, their earlier tension melting away like frost in the sunlight. Caroline watched them as she worked, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. Here they were, all together at last, her family whole again. For the first time in weeks, in years really, the house felt truly alive. Laughter echoed off the walls as Tommy told a joke, and Malik's responding chuckle was the sweetest sound Caroline had ever heard. This was more than just breakfast, it was their first meal as a complete family. The Sunday afternoon sun filtered through the living room windows, casting a warm glow across the family gathered on the couch. Caroline sat in her favorite armchair, while Tommy and Malik sprawled on the opposite ends of the sofa. On the TV screen, their chosen movie played, but Caroline found herself watching her sons more than the film. Malik had his legs tucked under him, completely at ease, a stark contrast to his earlier tension. Tommy reached over to grab a handful of popcorn, deliberately spilling some on Malik's lap. "Hey!" Malik protested, but his eyes sparkled with amusement. He tossed a kernel back at Tommy, who caught it in his mouth with exaggerated triumph. "Did you see that?" Tommy grinned. "Pure talent." "Pure luck," Malik corrected, rolling his eyes. They launched into an animated discussion about their latest video game obsession, trading playful insults and strategic tips. "No way you beat that level without cheating," Tommy insisted. "Just because you can't figure it out doesn't mean I cheated," Malik shot back, smirking. Caroline watched them, her heart swelling with joy. The easy banter between them felt natural, as if they'd never been separated. She couldn't help stealing glances at Malik, still amazed that he was really here. When he caught her looking instead of tensing up as he once would have, he offered her a warm smile that reached his eyes. Tommy turned to Malik, his expression suddenly shy but hopeful. "So, we're really brothers now, huh?" Malik's face softened. "Yeah," he said, letting out a small laugh. "I guess we are." "Good," Tommy nodded firmly, "because I already told everyone at school." Caroline joined in their laughter, her eyes misty with happiness. The sound of their combined joy filled the room, chasing away the last shadows of their past pain. As the afternoon light began to fade, they remained together, sharing stories and memories. Tommy told Malik about all the video games he'd have to catch up on, while Malik described some of his favorite books. The movie long forgotten, they sat in their own comfortable bubble of family warmth. Caroline watched as her sons, both of them, finally together, continued to bond, their earlier uncertainties completely dissolved. As evening approached, Malik shifted closer to Caroline's chair. He looked up at her, his eyes full of emotion. "Thanks for never giving up on me," he whispered. Caroline smiled, reaching out to pull him closer. She wrapped her arm around him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Her son, home at last. The autumn evening brought a crisp chill to the air outside, but inside the Lawson home, warmth radiated from both the kitchen and the hearts within. Caroline moved deliberately around the dining table, placing each fork and knife with care, as if setting the stage for something important. The aroma of roasted chicken and vegetables filled every corner of the house. Tommy's footsteps thundered down the stairs. "Mom, you really trying to make me wait for the food, huh?" He leaned against the doorframe, a playful smirk on his face. Malik followed more quietly, hovering near the kitchen entrance. His hands were tucked into his pockets, but his eyes held a contentment that hadn't been there before. As they settled around the table, Tommy and Malik exchanged quick glances, their usual banter momentarily suspended by the weight of this simple family moment. Caroline's heart swelled as she watched them, her smile gentle and warm. "How's school going, Malik?" she asked, passing him the bowl of mashed potatoes. Malik shrugged, but his shoulders relaxed slightly. "It's okay." "Okay?" Tommy scoffed. "He's barely at school anymore. Too busy thinking about beating my high score in that new game." A genuine chuckle escaped Malik's lips. "I haven't had a home-cooked meal like this in... I can't even remember how long." His voice grew softer. "It feels nice, like I'm part of something." Tommy rolled his eyes, but Caroline caught the slight upturn of his lips. "You know," Caroline said softly, "Isaiah used to try sneaking bites when he thought I wasn't looking." She smiled at the memory. "And he loved playing outside with Tommy, even though Tommy was barely walking then." Malik listened intently, his fork pausing midway to his mouth. His eyes held a mix of emotions: curiosity, sadness, and something like belonging. Tommy, sensing the heaviness in the air, piped up, "Yeah, well, at least you don't eat like a vacuum cleaner anymore." He mimicked exaggerated eating sounds, causing Malik to burst into genuine laughter. Caroline watched her boys, her eyes growing misty. The sound of their shared laughter filled the kitchen, a sound she'd dreamed of hearing for years. Here they were, her family, broken but healing, separated but found, finally together around one table. "We're all together now," she whispered to herself, watching as Tommy and Malik shared a look of understanding. No longer just friends, but brothers, finding their way back to each other. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the small attic window. Caroline and Malik stood among stacks of cardboard boxes, each one holding pieces of the past. Caroline's hands trembled slightly as she reached for a box marked Isaiah in faded black marker. Malik watched, his heart beating faster. He'd been eyeing that box for days, curious but afraid of what he might find inside. The cardboard flaps creaked as Caroline opened it, revealing treasures from another life. His life, though he couldn't remember it. A small red toy truck sat on top, its paint slightly chipped but still bright. Malik's eyes fixed on it immediately. Something about it felt familiar, like a dream he couldn't quite recall. Caroline noticed his gaze and picked up the truck carefully. That was Isaiah's favorite, she said softly, her voice catching slightly. You used to carry it everywhere. Malik shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the weight of memories he didn't have. He reached out hesitantly, then pulled his hand back. It's okay, Caroline encouraged, holding out the truck. You can touch it. As Malik took the toy, Caroline pulled out a photo album. They sat together on an old trunk, and she began turning pages filled with snapshots of a toddler's life. Birthday parties, first steps, playground adventures. In every photo, the little boy wore the same smile Malik saw in the mirror every day. Look, Caroline pointed to a picture of Isaiah clutching the red truck. This was your third birthday. Malik stared at the photo, trying to find any hint of recognition in his mind. The frustration must have shown on his face because Caroline touched his arm gently. It's okay if you don't remember, she said, her voice warm and understanding. You don't have to remember to be part of this family. Those words seemed to lift a weight from Malik's shoulders. He looked at the truck again, then reached into the box. His fingers found a small teddy bear, worn soft with love, and a silver picture frame holding a photo of Isaiah and Tommy playing in a sprinkler. Can I? He hesitated. Can I keep these? Caroline's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. Of course you can. Malik gathered the items in his arms and closed the box, feeling something settle in his chest. He wasn't just the boy in these photos anymore. He was someone new, someone who could be both Malik and Isaiah. Thank you, he whispered. And Caroline understood he meant more than just the toys. As they stood to leave the attic, Malik clutched the toy truck, feeling its familiar weight in his hands. He looked up at Caroline and smiled. I think I'm ready for the next chapter. Caroline nodded, her heart swelling with pride for the boy who'd found his way back home. The autumn sun hung low in the sky as Tommy bounced the soccer ball on his knee. A challenging grin spread across his face. Malik stood a few feet away, hands tucked into his hoodie pockets, watching with slight uncertainty. Come on, Tommy called out, letting the ball drop to the grass. One-on-one, unless you're scared? Malik raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at his lips. Scared? Of you? Then prove it, Tommy teased, already dribbling the ball between his feet. Malik hesitated for a moment, then shrugged off his hoodie. The familiar weight of competition settled over him as he squared up against Tommy. The game started slowly, both boys testing each other's skills. Tommy was quick, darting left and right with the ball, but Malik matched his movements step for step. Their initial caution melted away as the competitive spirit took over. That all you got? Malik taunted as he stole the ball, spinning past Tommy with surprising agility. Tommy laughed, chasing after him. Just warming up. They raced across the yard, their sneakers tearing up grass as they fought for control. Malik's speed caught Tommy off guard. He wasn't expecting such skill from his usually quiet brother. In a burst of playful frustration, Tommy launched himself at Malik, tackling him to the ground. The ball rolled away forgotten as both boys tumbled onto the grass, laughing breathlessly. Man, you're actually good, Tommy admitted, still sprawled on his back, chest heaving. Malik grinned, grass stains decorating his t-shirt. Surprised? Tommy propped himself up on his elbows, looking at Malik with newfound respect. So you really are staying, huh? The question hung in the air for a moment. Malik's smile softened as he nodded. Yeah, I think I am. From the porch, Caroline watched her sons, tears pricking at her eyes. The sound of their laughter, the sight of them playing together. It was everything she'd dreamed of for so long. The boys continued their game, arguing good-naturedly about phantom fouls and disputed goals. Their voices carried across the yard, filled with the kind of comfortable banter that only brothers could share. As the sun began to set, they finally called it quits, throwing their arms around each other's shoulders as they walked back to the house. They collapsed onto the porch steps, accepting tall glasses of lemonade from Caroline. Did you see that goal I scored? Tommy bragged, nudging Malik with his elbow. You mean when you tripped over your own feet? Malik shot back, grinning. They launched into an animated discussion about their favorite video games, their voices blending together in the growing dusk. Caroline stepped outside, her heart full as she watched her sons, finally together, finally whole. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Caroline's car pulled up to Angela's house. Malik sat in the passenger seat, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. The familiar sight of Angela's small garden and wind chimes brought a mix of comfort and anxiety. "You okay?" Caroline asked softly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Malik nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yeah, I need to do this." Angela opened the door before they reached it, her warm smile tinged with a hint of sadness. Her eyes were kind as she welcomed them inside, the scent of fresh-baked cookies filling the air. "I'll give you two some time," Caroline said, squeezing Malik's shoulder before stepping back. In the living room, Malik settled into the familiar worn couch where he'd spent countless hours doing homework and playing games. Angela sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. "I've missed you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Malik swallowed hard. "I'm sorry I left like that." "No, sweetheart." Angela shook her head. "You have nothing to be sorry for. I always knew this day might come." Tears welled up in Malik's eyes. "You were the only mother I knew for so long. I feel like I'm betraying you." "Listen to me," Angela said, taking his hands in hers. "You'll always have a place in my heart. Nothing will ever change that. Finding your family doesn't mean losing me." Malik's voice cracked as he whispered, "Thank you for everything, Angela. I love you." Angela pulled him into a tight hug, her tears falling freely now. "I'll always love you too." When they pulled apart, Angela reached for a small bag beside the couch. "I want you to have these," she said, handing it to him. Inside were photo albums, his old drawings, and small mementos from their years together. As Caroline and Malik prepared to leave, the air felt lighter somehow. Angela hugged them both, her smile genuine despite her tears. In the car, Caroline glanced at Malik, noting the peaceful expression on his face. "Are you ready for this new chapter?" Malik smiled, holding the bag of memories close. "Yeah, I think I am." The kitchen table was bathed in warm afternoon sunlight as Caroline and Malik sat together, the adoption paperwork spread before them. Caroline's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the pen, her signature flowing across the dotted lines. Each stroke felt momentous, like pieces of her heart being permanently sealed onto paper. Malik watched intently, his fingers drumming nervously against his knee. The papers looked so official, so final. His eyes traced over the words that would legally make him Caroline's son again, though in his heart, he already knew where he belonged. Caroline set down her pen and turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Once you sign these, you'll officially be a part of our family. No going back." Her voice was soft but steady, filled with love and certainty. Malik stared at the papers, his heart pounding against his ribs. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about changing his name or where he lived. It was about accepting who he truly was, about embracing his place in this family. He picked up the pen, his hand shaking slightly. Looking up, his eyes met Caroline's, and in that moment, he felt the strength of her love wash over him. It steadied his nerves and calmed his racing thoughts. This was right. This was home. With careful strokes, he signed his name. Caroline let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Welcome home, baby," she whispered, pulling him into a tight embrace. Malik melted into her arms, feeling the last pieces of uncertainty fall away. From the hallway, Tommy watched the scene unfold. A genuine smile spread across his face as he gave Malik a thumbs up, his silent but clear approval of officially welcoming his brother home. Caroline pulled back slightly, tears now freely falling down her cheeks. She cupped Malik's face in her hands, studying the features she'd missed for so long. "We're a family now. Forever," she whispered. Malik closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him. For the first time in his life, he felt completely at peace. He knew exactly who he was and where he belonged. Tommy stepped forward from his spot in the hallway, joining them at the table. The three of them came together in a group hug, sharing a moment of pure family unity. No more uncertainty, no more separation, just love, acceptance, and the promise of a future together. The living room glowed with the warm light of Christmas decorations, casting a magical shimmer across the walls. Caroline hummed softly as she pulled another batch of gingerbread cookies from the oven, the sweet, spicy aroma filling every corner of the house. "I should put the star on top," Tommy declared, holding the golden ornament high above his head. "I'm taller." "By like an inch," Malik protested, reaching for it. "And I've never done it before." Their playful argument echoed through the house, punctuated by bursts of laughter. Caroline paused in the kitchen doorway, her heart swelling as she watched them. Tears welled in her eyes as she remembered the tension-filled days just weeks ago, when everything felt uncertain and fragile. "Hey," Tommy said suddenly, lowering the star. "Maybe we could do it together?" Malik's face lit up. "Yeah?" The boys worked together, carefully balancing on chairs to reach the top of the tree. Their teamwork made Caroline's heart soar. It was the first time they'd truly collaborated as brothers. Later, they gathered by the crackling fireplace, steam rising from mugs of hot chocolate topped with mini marshmallows. Malik's eyes kept drifting to his Christmas stocking hanging on the mantel, the first one he'd ever had. His name was carefully stitched in red thread, matching Tommy's and Caroline's. He reached up occasionally to run his fingers over the letters, as if making sure they were real. "Time for some early presents," Caroline announced, bringing out carefully wrapped packages. Malik's hands shook slightly as he opened his first gift, a leather-bound photo album. Inside were carefully preserved photos of Isaiah's early years, each one telling a story of who he once was. He traced the images with gentle fingers, understanding blooming in his eyes. "And this is from me," Tommy said, thrusting a small package toward Malik. Inside was a handmade bracelet, woven from different colored threads. "It's for my brother," Tommy added quietly, a slight blush coloring his cheeks. Malik slipped it onto his wrist immediately, his eyes bright with emotion. He looked around the room, at the twinkling lights, the decorated tree, the stockings hanging in a row, and felt something settle in his chest. "This is home," he whispered, barely audible above the crackling fire. Caroline wrapped her arm around him, pulling him close as the flames danced in the fireplace, casting warm shadows across their faces. The scent of gingerbread and pine needles mingled in the air, creating the perfect Christmas Eve atmosphere. Sunlight streamed through the curtains as Malik lay in his new bed, staring at the ceiling. The morning felt different somehow, quieter, more peaceful. Yet beneath that peace, a nagging worry tugged at his thoughts. He'd slept better than he had in years, but questions about his past still haunted him. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Caroline peeked in, carrying a tray loaded with pancakes, eggs, and orange juice. Her smile was warm as she noticed his distant expression. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said softly, setting the tray on his nightstand. She sat beside him on the bed, the mattress dipping slightly under her weight. Malik turned to look at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "What if I don't remember?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Caroline's hand found his hair, gently stroking it back from his forehead. The gesture felt natural, maternal. "It doesn't matter, sweetheart. You're here now. You're my son. That's all that matters." Malik nodded slowly, but his mind still felt caught between two worlds. The past he couldn't recall, and the present that somehow felt both new and familiar. "I love you," Caroline continued, her voice thick with emotion. "We're together now, and that's how it's going to stay, no matter what you remember or don't remember." Footsteps in the hallway announced Tommy's arrival. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene before him. Without a word, he crossed the room and wrapped his arms around Malik in a quick but fierce hug. "You're my brother no matter what," Tommy whispered, his usual bravado replaced by quiet sincerity. The tension in Malik's shoulders began to ease, He took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. Maybe he didn't need to remember everything. Maybe being here now was enough. Caroline reached for the breakfast tray, setting it across Malik's lap. Tommy plopped down at the foot of the bed, snagging a piece of bacon with a grin. For the first time, they felt like a complete family. Not perfect, but whole. Malik looked up at Caroline, a small smile finally breaking through. "Thanks," he whispered, feeling the truth of it deep in his heart. This was home. This was where he belonged. They sat together, sharing breakfast and quiet conversation, united in the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it together as a family. The afternoon sun bathed the backyard in golden light as smoke wafted from the grill. Tommy leaned against the porch railing, watching Malik struggle with the burgers. "Come on, slowpoke," Tommy called out, grinning. "Even a turtle could flip those faster." Malik rolled his eyes but couldn't hide his smile. "You want to come do this yourself?" Caroline sat in a lawn chair nearby, watching her boys with quiet joy. The past few months had been a journey, from confusion and pain to something beautiful. Seeing them joke and tease like real brothers made her heart swell. The burgers sizzled on the grill as Malik stood there, spatula in hand. Something shifted in his expression, and he grew quiet. His grip tightened on the spatula as he seemed to wrestle with his thoughts. Finally, he turned slightly toward Caroline, his voice soft and uncertain. "Hey, Mom?" Caroline froze. The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. That single word, one she'd dreamed of hearing again for 10 long years, brought tears to her eyes. She turned to face him fully, her heart pounding. "Yes, baby," she managed to whisper. Malik swallowed hard, his own eyes glistening. "Thanks for not giving up on me." Caroline crossed the distance between them in seconds, wrapping him in a tight embrace. All the years of searching, hoping, and praying crashed over her like a wave. She held him close, feeling his slight trembling match her own. Tommy watched from the porch, his usual playful demeanor replaced with a genuine smile. "Does this mean we're really brothers now?" Malik looked over Caroline's shoulder at Tommy, a soft smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, I think it does." Caroline held Malik tighter, her voice thick with emotion as she whispered, "I love you, baby. You'll always be my son." Malik closed his eyes, melting into her embrace. The warmth of her arms, the familiar scent of her perfume, the sound of Tommy's footsteps on the porch, it all felt right. For the first time in 10 years, he truly felt home. If you enjoyed the story of Caroline, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.